Hey folks, it's Friday and it's video time. Today we have our third session from our network series, but before we start I'd like to give you a short introduction about me. My name is Lagler-Gruener. I'm a multi-cloud architect in one of the biggest consulting company in Austria. I'm working since 2012 with public cloud, mainly focused on Microsoft Azure at the beginning. And over the time, I'm realizing it's a good idea to go more broader and also specializing into AWS and GCP too. You can see I have many certifications in different areas, mainly in Microsoft Azure. So I have a broad certification level in Microsoft Azure. And at the moment, 2 certifications in AWS and 1 certification in GCP. You can find my social footprint on Facebook, Twitter, Xing, LinkedIn. I also have a private blog and for sure my YouTube channel. So enough from me, so let's start with the topic from today. Today we talk about PaaS networking settings. So this is my third session from a networking series, and today we have the PaaS options. So this is a video from video type nugget and from video category level 300. So we go more into technical details, keep this in mind. So the agenda from today, first of all, we talk about why should we use PaaS services, and why should we use PaaS services with networking settings. Then we go one step further and talk about which networking options do we have for PaaS services. And then you can see an architecture sample. Based on this architecture sample, I will demonstrate my live demo. Okay, let's start. PaaS services. What is the benefit from PaaS services? When you use PaaS services instead of infrastructure as service, Microsoft is more responsible for the service. So it's go up to the data layer. Everything which is behind the data layer is responding by Microsoft. So Microsoft is checking, is the virtual machine available? Is it high available? Is it patched? Is it secure? And is there an issue? Is there a new patch available and so on? And everything above is your responsibility. So you have to code your application, you have to deploy your application, you have to back up for sure the application code, and this is your part. So keep this in mind, you have much lesser operating task which will do by Microsoft, and only the development and deployment task. So when you use PaaS services, their access to the PaaS services normally over a shared public IP address. So PaaS services aren't connected per default inside your virtual network. So there's no private IP address for that PaaS service available. Each PaaS service has normally a shared public IP address, and the communication from your on-premise environment to these PaaS services is over the public IP address. So this means if you try to access, for example, to an Azure SQL Server database, a PaaS service, database as a service, you have to activate port 1433 on your firewall for outgoing communication to the Azure environment. So if you talk with a firewall engineer, he will say, okay, not really a good idea, go to another service and use it. So one problem here, because the communication is normally over the internet. Normally, if you're using Express Route, Microsoft Express Route is the direct connection to the Azure cloud, you have the ability to use the Microsoft peering. The Microsoft peering means you get all public IP addresses from the Microsoft data center, which you prefer. Over BGP, you learn all public IP addresses, and then communication to those public IP addresses will be routed over the Microsoft peering. So you can define, okay, port 1433 is not enabled to the whole internet, only to the Microsoft peering it's enabled. So keep this in mind. This is the option what you have for ExpressRoute, but normally my customers are using site-to-site VPN, and site-to-site VPN means you have only the ability to connect to private IP addresses to the cloud. And for sure, if you need a tighter security control, it's also a good idea to connect PaaS services inside your virtual network. So, okay, what kind of options do we have? We have two options. We have the option Azure Private Link or Private Endpoint and Service Endpoint. These are the two options that we have to connect PaaS services to the internal network. Okay, let's talk about Private Link or Private Endpoint. Private Link is a service which is privately accessible. So this means you have the ability to connect, for example, a database as a service over Private Link inside your internal network, and you have the ability to connect to the private IP address from the Private Link to the database. So you have a reverse proxy. This Private Link get all the traffic and route to a PaaS service. So the benefit from this service is you have the ability to connect from on-premise over site-to-site VPN connections to the private IP address and will be routed to the PaaS services. You have the protection against data leakage, for sure. You have a global reach also. This means if you have, for example, the database in Western Europe hosted and you have a connected VNet over peering from East to West, for example, you have the ability to connect also to the private IP address to the service from other global services, global VPNs. And you have to extend your own services option too. So Private Link is for PaaS services, and Private Link Service is the option what you have for your own services. So you can bind services behind a standard load balancer and give a Private Link service to this application, and then you have the ability to connect to a private service, to a private IP address over the Private Link service. So for which services is this Private Link available? You can see here we have AI machine learning services, we have analytics services, we have compute services, we have containers for sure, we have databases as a service, we have integration services, IoT services, management and governance services like Azure Automation, Azure Backup, security services like Azure Key Vault, and storage account and web account. And if you want to use Azure Private Link Service, you have to have an Azure standard load balancer in front of your services. Okay, this is Private Link, so keep in mind this is an extra service. You have an extra charge for this service, and you have a private IP address. You communicate with a private IP address to your PaaS service. And second one, we have Azure Service Endpoint. Azure Service Endpoint provides a secure direct connectivity to the Azure services. You can see on the right side, when we try to connect to an Azure storage account, for example, from a virtual machine, you can connect the Azure storage account inside your virtual network, and you have the ability to say, okay, only resources from this subnet are able to connect to this service. But keep in mind, this doesn't mean, okay, the storage account, for example, have a private IP address. No, you connect to the public IP address, but you have the ability to say, okay, only from this subnet it's allowed. It's optimal routing for Azure services. So if you use it, you have the optimal routing. It's really simple from the setup perspective. But, and this is the highly part here, you have no private IP address. So if you try to connect from your on-premise environment, you have no ability to connect to a private IP address, for example, to the storage account over a private IP address. You have to activate the firewall option for this service too. So this is only a good perspective for cloud-only services which are hosted inside Azure Cloud, but not if you have a service from on-premise to connect to this service. Okay, for which service does private service endpoint is available? You can see here we have the ability to bind service endpoint to an Azure storage account, to an Azure SQL database, to a Synapse database, or different other databases, to a Key Vault, to a Service Bus, Event Hub, Data Lake generation 1, and for sure generation 2 also, because it's inside Azure storage account. Then also Azure App Services and Azure Cognitive Services. Okay, we are now finished with the theory session. We are now going to our sample architecture. So let's take a look to our current situation. We have a web application. The web application is a 3-tier application. We have our front-end web app. We have for the connection string a Key Vault in place and a SQL database in the backend, which hold our data. So normally you have the ability to connect from each service to the Azure Key Vault. So it's open, so all networks are allowed to connect. We have also the ability to connect to the SQL database if you enable the firewall ports from the internet. So this is the current state, and we take a look to different options that we have. So first of all, I will demonstrate how you can use service endpoint to based on the architecture. So you implement the architecture in service endpoint, and only this service is only available from your selected subnet. And the second option, I will demonstrate the private link option. So the communication is not over the public IP address, as the communication is over the private IP address. Okay, so let's start with our demo environment. Okay, we are now in the demo environment. You can see I have here a separate resource group named RG Demo PaaS Networking. Inside this resource group, you can see different services. So we have a Key Vault, I have a web app, I have a SQL server, including a SQL database. So let's switch back to our sample architecture, and I will show you something. So we have here our sample architecture. So the bad thing here is we are able to connect from each network to the Azure Key Vault. We are able to connect from each network to the SQL database. And the bad thing from the SQL database perspective is the option allow Azure services to connect. What does this mean? Each public IP address from the Azure cloud, from the region West Europe, have the ability to connect to the database server. You lose one security layer, the firewalling rule layer, and have only one option or one layer here available, and this is a username and authentication layer. So let's switch back to our demo environment. So let's take a look to our database. So when we are going to the database, you have on the upper left, you have the firewall options. And inside the firewall options, you have here the option allow Azure services to connect to this service. So the first thing what we have to do is we have to disable this option here. But when we do this, when we click here on save, in a few minutes, we get an error when we refresh the web application. So let's take a look to the web application and refresh. Now you can see I'm not able to connect to the database anymore. So I have the ability to connect to my Azure Key Vault, no problem. It's the public IP address from my Azure Key Vault to get the connection string. I have here my SQL server with the public IP address, everything is okay. But when I'm trying to connect to the database, you can see here I'm not able to connect because the public IP address 20.73.118.128 is not allowed to connect to the database because we have disabled the option allow Azure services to connect. So what we try to do now is let's switch back to our architecture. The first thing what we have done is we have disabled allow Azure services to connect. Then we go one step further and activate the private or the service endpoint for our Azure Key Vault, for our Azure SQL database, and at the end for sure for our web application. So let's go ahead and do this. So we have here. So let's start. So first of all, we have to enable private service endpoint for our database service. So we have here the option virtual network, add an exist one, and select the rule name, select the right virtual network. In this case, I'm selecting the front-end subnet. The service endpoint state should be enabled. If it's not enabled, the wizard here enabled this for you. So in this case, everything is in place. Now I click on OK. Now I'm updating my server rules, my server VNet rules. And when it's done, the SQL service is now bind via service endpoint to our virtual network. So let's go ahead. Now it's done. Perfect. So let's go ahead and enable the option for our Azure Key Vault 2. So go ahead and click on networking, and inside the networking you have the same options. You have here all networks are allowed, and in this case I want to enable private endpoint. Select an existing private virtual network. Select my demo network and also the front-end subnet. Click on add and now click on save. It will also take some time. And when we refresh now our web application, you can see we are not able to connect to the Azure Key Vault because now Azure Key Vault is bind to the virtual network and to the front-end subnet. So you can see here, cannot get secret. And that's the reason because it's now bind and only allowed from the subnet frontend to connect or to get secrets from the Key Vault. So when we go back to the Key Vault and try to get secrets, you will see when we refresh, and now it's done, we are not able to get the secrets from the client IP address. From my client IP address, it's not allowed. So we are now inside the virtual network. We are only accessible. We have only access to from our virtual network. And the last step is I have to enable service endpoint for our web application too. So let's go ahead. On the left side, you see networking, the networking option from my web app. Click here on configure, VNet integration. Click here add VNet. Select the demo VNet, also the front-end subnet. Click on OK. After a few seconds, you see I'm now connected to the virtual network, And when I go back to my web application and refresh the web application, everything should work again. So now you can see we are now able to use the application. We are able to connect to the Azure Key Vault. We are able to connect to the database and get all settings, all entries from the Azure from the database. So I want to show you now that this is not really a caching option here. So I'm now connected to my SQL database and add a second line of test and test 1, 2, 3, 4. Now it's saved. So I'm clicking now here on refresh, and you can see here I have now 2 entries inside my database. Okay, so let's go ahead, reset everything to the base option. What we have done here, you can see now inside my architecture, we are now able to connect to the database and to the Azure Key Vault only from the virtual network, which is defined in my service endpoint configuration. So let's go ahead to our second architecture, private link. I will demonstrate now the private link. The current situation is the same. So we have Azure Key Vault is accessible over the internet. Azure SQL database is also accessible over the internet, and the web application too. The bad thing is the same, like service endpoint, and our goal should be we have the ability to connect to a private IP address, for example, to the Azure Key Vault, and for sure to the SQL database. So let's start. Okay, we have the same situation. I have redeployed the application. You can see here I have my web application, I have my Key Vault, and I have my SQL database for sure. So let's take a look to our web application. Everything is working. We are connecting to the Azure Key Vault over the public IP address, get the connection string, connect to the SQL database, to the public IP address, get all entries, in this case 2 entries, and show or display the value from the first entry. Okay, now we want to implement those services into a virtual network and access to those services over the private IP address, and we are using to achieve this private link. Okay, let's start with the SQL database. First of all, we go to the SQL server. On the left side, you can see here firewall and virtual networks. And the first thing what I'm disabling is allow Azure services to connect. So I select no and disable with this feature the connectivity from all public IP addresses inside, in this case, Western Europe. So you can see here I have a private endpoint connection option here. Click on create a private endpoint. I want to create a new one for this SQL server. Select the subscription, select the resource group, define a name, private endpoint, demo app database. Select the region, in my case is Western Europe. Click on next to select the resource type. In this case, I want to add a SQL server. So Microsoft.SQL server. Then should select a SQL server. In this case, I have an existing one. Click on next, and here is now the VNet configuration. Where should the private endpoint, on which virtual network the SQL database should be connected over private endpoint. In this case, I have here my predefined virtual network, and I'm selecting the backend subnet. Now I want to create a private, integrate into private DNS zone. So we need this for future binding to our virtual network. So I create a new one, click on next, and click on create and review. If everything is validated, click on create. So the deployment step should take a few seconds, and when everything is finished, you should see deployment is successful. Okay, we are now ready. Everything is deployed successful. So go ahead and switch back to our resource group. So we are now able to connect to the SQL database over private IP address. I will show this a little bit later. So now let's go to the Azure Key Vault, do the same. On the left side, you can see here I have my networking option, and inside the networking option, I'm selecting here private endpoint connection and click on create a new private endpoint. Same situation, select a subscription, select a resource group, define a name. Define a name, select the right region, West Europe in my case, click on next, select your resource type. In this case we want to add a Azure Key Vault, select the Key Vault. In my case it's inside my resource group, click on configure, select the right virtual network. In my case it's this virtual network inside the backend. I also want to create a private DNS zone for my Key Vault. Click on next. I'm not adding any tags anymore. Click on create, and we should also wait a few seconds for the deployment, and when everything is in place, we are ready to connect to the Key Vault over private IP address and also to the SQL Server over private IP address. Okay, the deployment is now succeeded, so let's go back to our resource group and select the Azure Key Vault once more, because we have to enable under the network settings that only private endpoint and selected networks are able to connect to the Key Vault. So click on save. And now we are not able to get any secrets anymore. And the last step here is we want to add the web app also to our virtual network. Here's a little bit different because we don't want to add a private service endpoint for that web application. We only want to add this web application inside a virtual network with VNet integration. The reason for that is we want to connect to the web application over the public internet. It's okay for me, and then the web application is connecting to a private IP address over the virtual network to the backend services. So let's go ahead, click here on configure virtual network. And here is everything assigned. So we are now assigned to a virtual network. In this case, I'm assigned to my backend, to my front end virtual network. So let's go back, and here is some steps what we keep in mind. A web application per default doesn't route each traffic over the VNet integration. And also don't use the private DNS zones to resolve the new private IP address for my backend services. To achieve this, I go here into configuration settings and add two new options. The first option is web server, website DNS server. So I'm click here on add a new one, website DNS server, and here I'm selecting the Microsoft DNS server. In this case, is this one here. Click on OK. The second one is website VNet routing. I want to route each traffic over the virtual network. In this case, select one here. Click on add, click on save, and auto refresh also the web application. When it's done, we are switching back to our web application and validate the result. So let's switch back. Here you can see this is the old configuration. We are connecting to the public IP address from the Azure Key Vault and also for the Azure database. And when we click here on refresh, you can see, oh, it's perfect. We are now connecting to the Azure Key Vault over the private link. So we have here a private IP address 10.0.2.5 and get the connection string from the Key Vault. It's successful. And then we are connecting to the database with the name and with the private IP address 10.0.2.4. So everything is working. We are now in the following situation. We have our goal achieved. So it's only able to connect to the backend services over the private link service. So with the private IP address, and the connection is established from a PaaS service. In this picture, what you see, I'm implement a virtual machine, but you can use also what I show you, a web application to get an application cycle or an application based on platform as a service. So we are now at the end. I hope you enjoy the session. It's a little bit deeper, it's a little bit difficult to implement, but if you have any questions, write to my YouTube channel, send me a feedback. I highly recommend this. So this is the end from the session from today. So keep in mind, network connection for PaaS services is also available. Have fun and see you soon.